Okay, so it falls to me to call for questions. And we'll go straight to the front row in the middle here.
Hi, thank you, Dr. Marxsen, Ben Potter from the Australian Financial Review. You took a very long-term view, but I'm wondering if you can cast your mind forward to next summer and tell us which of the available options for shoring up security in the South Australian market, being an interconnector, a gas peaking plant, the possible restart of the northern power station, which has been flagged by a Queensland investor, and batteries located at various spots in the grid would be ready for next summer, and which would be the easiest to achieve in that short time frame. Thanks.
Thanks. Thanks, Ben. We have done some extensive modelling on the case of Hazelwood closure. Of course, Hazelwood doesn't close until the end of March next year, so to some extent it's not next summer that we have a tight situation, it's the one after that when Hazelwood will be shut down. Our modelling shows that if the market response to the tight demand situation is that gas generation, which has been relatively inactive over recent times, returns to the market, there is no real crunch and no real threat to system security during that summer period.
So I was asking about northern and South Australia, not so much the northern power station, which Professor Baker has talked about being able to reopen with contractors, BHP.
Our modelling doesn't show any need for additional coal generation in South Australia in the case of Hazelwood shutdown. The report, the modelling and the report are on our website.
So I will just, sorry, didn't get the chance to say, if you could just, as Ben did, state your name and affiliation, please. And also, we're tight for time and I expect lots of questions, so if we could keep the questions themselves relatively brief. There's one in the back there. Sorry, I'm having trouble.
Dr. Marxsen, Matthew Warren from the Australian Energy Council. You're quoted in the Financial Review this morning talking about the benefits of a transmission line between South Australia and New South Wales based on the draft report released this morning. Now, I've had a quick glance at it. As I read it, the report is predicated on assuming that there is sort of national energy policy or strategy of some description to deliver the emissions reductions required. And obviously that asset, in the absence of that policy, could be quite contentious, given that without there being some carbon policy, then you'd have black coal generation importing into South Australia and undermining the viability of the already fragile remaining firm generators in South Australia. I'm just wondering, that didn't seem to be discussed in the draft report, whether you have any views about those kinds of assets in the absence of national climate policy.
A national climate policy is very much for policy decision makers. Our report, I think, documents pretty clearly that the scenarios that we've used for the modelling assumes that Australia will meet its COP21 carbon emission reductions targets, and that is that the energy sector will do its pro rata share of that reduction. I'm fairly sure that the report lays that out fairly clearly, but we haven't done alternative modelling based on speculation that Australia may not meet its targets.
Okay. Are there further questions? I might grab the opportunity myself to ask one. Okay, I'll come there in a moment. It struck me, looking at the interconnector-based solution, that we could start to think of an interconnector essentially as a, and I think you said it yourself, as a means of importing security and support services, or essentially keeping that spinning engine all spinning at the same speed, importing inertia. As we think further down the track, 20 and 50 years out, my question really is, where will that inertia originate from? What's AEMO's views on essentially what will be our rotating plant of the future?
It doesn't have to be rotating plant. It's basically mathematically equivalent. You could to battery storage, which with very fast frequency response. So there are a number of possible solutions. Certainly spinning plant, they're called in the report, I think, synchronous condensers, and they've been around for decades, or almost as long as grids have been around. So they do contribute inertia by virtue of the spinning mass of the rotor of the machine. But new solutions based on batteries with ultra-fast response and ultimately even extremely fast response with ultra-capacitor energy storage. The thing about inertia is that you don't need a huge amount of stored energy compared to, say, firming capacity to deal with the intermittency of wind and solar.
Thank you. There's a question on the top deck at the back.
Peter Farley from the Institution of Engineers. It seems to me that if you look at the way they operate in the US, for example, when there's a storm coming, most of the supply sources are limited to 75% or so of their capacity for exactly the reason we had in South Australia. We didn't seem to do that in South Australia. Is there a reason why we don't do it here?
I'd have to admit I'm not personally familiar with that practice in the US. Most of the practice I've seen in the US is not all that different to ours. We do a structured risk analysis on any sort of warning of risk, and we did on this occasion. The projected wind speeds, maximum wind speeds, were well below the design standard of the only double circuit tower line. Knocking over a double circuit line is a non-credible contingency, and if we thought that that was possible, if it was likely, then we would have reclassified it as credible. Knocking over a single circuit tower line, we always assume that could happen, so we run the grid that way. However, the forecast wind speeds were well below the design standards of the double circuit tower line. Of course, the forecast of 140 kilometres an hour was exceeded by, well, it was, according to the Bureau, roughly 250 to 260 kilometres an hour in the Wilmington tornado, which took down 4 towers on the double circuit line. So normal structured risk analysis would not have caused us to do things like back off generators or back off interconnected flows.
Can I make another comment? The Electricity Reliability Council in the US has shown that most gas turbines are pretty hopeless at providing F-gas services, and in fact their SCADA systems prevent them from providing it. So how is that being modelled in our future grid with more gas in it?
Once again, I can't comment on the issue you raise about the US situation. We have very well proven models of our gas turbine plants here in Australia, and we regularly schedule them for fast F-gas or regulating F-gas or whatever.
Down the front.
Jerome Farah, ASL Allen. Your supply-demand scenarios presumably include the Portland aluminium smelter going on business as usual. If hypothetically, not saying it's going to happen, who knows, but if that was to close, how would that affect your excess supply, excess demand scenarios in the next few years?
It would certainly ease the supply-demand challenge over summer periods in the short to medium term. And we have tested in some of the scenarios, like the weak scenario, I think in the NTNDP has smelters shutting in Australia, just to test what the effect that has on the transmission required for that scenario.
There's another one back up in the top deck.
Ross Garno, University of Melbourne, and Zen Energy. other jurisdictions with rapidly increasing roles for intermittent energy have been moving quite rapidly in introducing grid-level battery storage and pumped hydro storage to balance intermittency both in the wholesale market and the frequency control market. China in the 5 years, 2011 to 2015, as wind and solar grew very rapidly, put in 30 gigawatts of pumped hydro capacity. The United States has already got a gigawatt of grid-level battery capacity, mainly for grid stabilisation purposes. California, which is moving faster with intermittent renewables, has mandated the introduction of 1.3 gigawatts of grid-level battery storage by 2020. Are they wrong, or are we?
I'd prefer to say that neither of us is wrong. I'm aware of the American, particularly the Alamitos battery that's being built there. That is certainly a huge installation. It looks like two small factories. It's got about as much relationship to a torch battery as an elephant has to a flea, but it's to have enough firming capacity in a battery installation to cover 2 days' absence of wind just in South Australia alone would require approximately 100 of those installations. The cost at the moment of using battery storage for wind, for firming power for wind, is pretty prohibitive. It's very attractive at the distribution network level. So if you look at the database of batteries that have been built for grid use around the world, there's only about 5 that are above 100 megawatt hours. There are 500 that are between 20 and 100 megawatt hours, and that's the typical size that you would put in to support a neighbourhood. So I think the role of batteries at the top of the grid is still something in the future, but batteries are certainly earning their keep a lot at the distribution level, and I'm confident that they will, as the costs continue to fall, they will expand into the transmission environment eventually.
Esther, there's one just behind you, Jamie Lowe.
Jamie Lowe, NG. Just on that point, I think we're effectively juxtaposing the choice between building greater interconnection and seeing where we go with other technology developments like batteries. We've been particularly bad in this industry at forecasting what's going to happen in the future, and it seems to me that we should be extremely cautious about suggesting we can see the pathway for interconnection in 2066. I mean, if we are moving to a position where batteries are going to be cheaper and that is a way to go, doing something like investing heavily in interconnection now basically will double our expense, but it will also undermine the very assets we need to use at the moment to provide stability, synchronous generators in that interim period. Because all things being equal, you build some interconnection, you should be reducing the value of generation in a particular region. So I think we should be very cautious about pushing too strongly on the interconnection route at this time.
So I think that might have been a statement. Thank you. Do we have any more? The card's up at the back. Thank you. Can't see who it is.
Dr. Marxsen, Kane Thornton from the Clean Energy Council. You gave us a bit of a sense of the pace of change in the energy sector over the past 5 years or so, and also a sense of what might come at us in the future. You also gave us some insight into some of the solutions and the technologies that are available for us into the future, things like rapid frequency response from storage. I'm interested in your views around some of the governance arrangements, the institutions. Feel free to pass judgment on policy making and the extent to which bodies like COAG Energy Council are moving us towards a more sophisticated policy discussion. in this country. But I guess more fundamentally, how are we going to ensure that the rulemaking, the decision making, the change process is well managed into the future, given the likely pace of change?
I think this is something that Dr. Alan Finkel raised with COAG, and COAG has referred to the Energy Council, which meets this week. And there is no doubt that as we head into this transition, the pace of change is speeding up, and perhaps the pace of setting up structures and rules and markets and so on to meet the changing needs has to be measured against the need. And at this stage, I know it's under active consideration. Our position is that the rules at the moment provide a pretty good basis for a lot of the stuff we do. It doesn't have an inertia market in it. We can't manage inertia if there are no synchronous machines on the network, so we need to have something there. And we're working with the AEMC on that. We're working with the AEMC on a rule change proposed by the South Australian Government to perhaps complement the dichotomy of credible and non-credible contingency events with a third category, which are rare but very high impact events that would allow us to take action if something like that threatened. Because our life is ruled by the rules, and getting the rules changed, we have to take into account stakeholders' views. They all have interests in this market, and it's a pretty big market. So there is a certain minimum time of getting things done that we have to respect.
It's intriguing, and I'm going to push in again. There's another question I'll come to in a minute. To me, though, that those two questions come in turn. One thing that I picked up in the report was it's a very physical solution, and it'll last for a very long time, and it'll take significant commitment of resources. And as was pointed out just a moment ago, those resources will reduce the value of other things that are already in existence. My question is, given what you know now, does AEMO see methods that could be used operationally with the existing kit that's in place that could have, with the benefit of hindsight, prevented or significantly reduced the outcomes that were experienced in South Australia? And to what extent are we pursuing legal and rule change-based options to prevent the need for significant investment in infrastructure?
I'll answer it in
I should say to defer. Sorry.
Two tranches. First about South Australia, and the changes we've made and the changes we made very quickly after the event would effectively prevent a recurrence in the same circumstances, and would reduce the risk of that type of outcome from a range of other circumstances. But it's not an absolute guarantee, but we have put in place a number of things just operationally. So there's no interconnectors or anything involved in that. There's no additional plant being built. On the question of interconnector planning, the approach we take is pretty much aligned with the philosophy of the NEM, and that is that the investment has to demonstrate benefits in the overall interest of the end consumer, the long-term interest of the end consumer. So basically we assess benefits. Those benefits can reduce the electricity price to consumers. We assess costs. Those costs will increase the electricity price to consumers. If the reductions due to the benefits outweigh the increases due to the costs, we do it over a 20-year period, then we feel that there is a reasonably good case to look at that one more closely. Now, a full RIT-T analysis would go into it in much more depth, but that's the sort of filter that we use to put a project in the NTNDP and say a RIT-T is warranted for this project.
Thank you. In the back, and then We'll come around to the middle.
David Byers from the Minerals Council. Tony, you didn't say much just on that last point about costs in your address. And given that we've seen prices rise by about 60% in the last 7 years for major electricity consumers in the business sector. What do you see that we're going to be looking at moving forward? Because none of the things that you talked about seem to be particularly low cost.
Well, as I have just sort of tried to explain, the things that we're talking about will actually reduce price because they have a net benefit. They will increase costs in some areas and reduce them in others. And if the project were to just increase costs and not produce a greater offsetting reduction in costs, then clearly we wouldn't be recommending it. So I think, you know, the point that we have made in the report as well is that arrangements for transmission procurement vary across Australia. In some jurisdictions we have regulated monopolies who seem to have a birthright to basically build every bit of transmission in that territory. In Victoria that isn't so. Victorian projects are put out to tender, so anyone can bid for them. And in our experience, the price that we get for an investment under that scheme is lower than the price we get under the regulated monopoly scheme. So you will have seen in the report that we believe this is a fundamental issue for Australia.
So we've got one question at the back, and I think I'm being told that we've only got time for that one more. So let's go up there.
Ken Marshman from Jana Investment Advisors. Tony, I was intrigued by your last chart and comment that never before have you faced such uncertainties in our forecast for the long term, I think, supply and demand for gas. What advice would you give to investors who are looking to own grid assets, transmission assets or pipeline assets given that long-term uncertainty?
I'm glad that I'm not in the investment advisor role, Ken. I leave that to far superior intellects in the industry. We run the numbers, we produce the projections, and we know that potential investors are interested in them, and they would then go out and do due diligence, such as the RIT-T process, before that they pulled out their chequebook. But yes, I know that the current level of uncertainty in the industry creates major challenges for investors.
So I think in summary, good luck is the advice. Okay, so that brings us to the end of the day. Thank you everybody for coming out. Personally, I found the discussion really interesting. Thank you, Tony, for taking the time to explain frequency to me. I'm now going to spend the rest of my life trying to understand how power lines rotate without falling down. But I'll get there one day. So look, thank you again for coming. Please everybody join me in thanking Tony for what was a really interesting presentation.